you very much for that warm, generous introduction. It is a great joy to stand before you today after last night's historic vote in the House of Lords. What an amazing, extraordinary decision that was. By a majority far greater than we ever expected, the House of Lords voted for marriage equality. All our anxieties and fears proved to be groundless, but I have to say that probably the size of that majority was partly down to people like yourselves who helped lobby members of the House of Lords. I suspect the margin would have been considerably narrower if people hadn't put out the stops and lobbied the Lords for equal marriage. And we know that thousands upon thousands of people did send emails, write letters, and make phone calls to individual members of the House of Lords. It's been one of the biggest lobbies of the Lords in its history. And the result we've won shows that lobbying does work and that even the unelected House of Lords can be on the side of the angels sometimes. The battle for same-sex marriage, of course, did not begin this year or last year or the year before. It began way back in 1992. In that year, the LGBT human rights group Outrage organised 5 same-sex couples to file an application for a marriage licence at Westminster Register Office in Marylebone. And they turned up, 2 women in resplendent bridal gear, 2 men in full top hat and tails, the others in more just general smart attire. We erected a huge wedding arch over the front of Westminster Register Office. The couples went in and made their applications. And of course the registrar said, well, I'm sorry, you can't be married, you're of the same sex. And they said to the registrar, well, where does it say that we can't be married? Which law? The registrar said, well, of course, it's in the Marriage Act, you can't be married. You have to be a male and a female. And so our couples, well primed, said to the registrar, well, could you please go and get a copy of the 1949 Marriage Act and show us where it says that marriage partners have to be male and female? So the registrar scurried off and came back a few minutes later, ashen-faced, because, of course, the main marriage law of this country, the 1949 Marriage Act, does not stipulate that marriage partners have to be male and female. So the registrar rushed off again and made some panicked phone calls to the Home Office and was eventually, of course, informed that it is under the 1973 Matrimonial Causes Act that same-sex marriage is banned. The 1973 Matrimonial Causes Act. That was the first time that same-sex marriage was prohibited in law. Well, actually, it was actually originally done in 1971 under the Nullity of Marriage Act, which was later superseded by the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973. But the point is, the legal ban on same-sex marriage is only 32 years old. So there is no tradition in British law that same-sex marriage has been banned. Anyway, those couples were unsuccessful, but that 1992 attempt was the opening shot in what has been a 21-year campaign to secure marriage equality. And it was reignited in 2010 when I coordinated the creation of the Equal Love campaign, which had 2 objectives. Firstly, to end the ban on same-sex civil marriages, but secondly, to also end the ban on heterosexual civil partnerships. Because just as a same-sex couple cannot have a civil marriage, a heterosexual couple cannot have a civil partnership. So this campaign for equal love was against both those twin bans. We tried at the time to negotiate with the party leaders. None of them were willing to touch this issue. So what we did was each of the 8 couples we organised together, 4 same-sex couples and 4 opposite-sex couples, each of those couples went to their local register office and filed applications. The same-sex couples filed an application for a civil marriage, the opposite-sex couples filed an application for a civil partnership. They were, of course, all refused, and they asked and requested and got a letter of refusal, which we then used to file an application in the European Court of Human Rights in February 2011. So we have a joint application in the European Court of Human Rights for same-sex couples, for opposite-sex couples, together seeking to overturn both the ban on same-sex civil marriages and opposite-sex civil partnerships. And that legal case is still ongoing. But it may be mere coincidence, but 3 months after the application was filed in the European Court, we made representations, the Equal Love Campaign made representations to the new coalition government. And we said to them, look, sooner or later you're going to have to go to Strasbourg and justify these twin discriminations. What are you going to say? What arguments are you going to use? Any arguments you use are going to look bigoted, intolerant and discriminatory. You're not going to look good. Wouldn't it be better if the British government took the lead and decided to change things without having to go through the European Court of Human Rights? And we were given a polite, yes, thank you, goodbye. But then, a short time afterwards, the government announced it was going to do a consultation on ending the ban on same-sex civil marriage. And that is what happened. As you know, last year there was a consultation, a public consultation, where 53% of those who responded via the government website said they wanted to see civil marriages opened up to same-sex couples. But the consultation, at my insistence, also asked people about their attitude towards heterosexual civil partnerships. And 61% of people who responded to the government consultation said they believed that civil partnerships should also be opened up, in this case, to heterosexual couples. So the government's own consultation in 2012 was very, very clear. A majority of the people who responded in the largest ever public consultation on policy by any British government in history, the vast majority said they wanted equality in both civil partnership and civil marriage law. So that is where we are now in the situation where the government has agreed to bring forward the legislation currently before Parliament and passed so overwhelmingly last night in the House of Lords. The Marriage Same-Sex Couples Bill is the fruition of that campaign, the consultation and the lobbying. But of course, the government is still insisting that it will not agree to heterosexual couples being able to have a civil partnership. And that, to me, is only half equality. You know, the government has said very clearly and honourably that the reason it's legislating same-sex marriage is because of the principle of equality, that we should all be equal before the law. And that's a policy or a view that I entirely agree with. But of course, it's not truly equal if heterosexual couples cannot have the option of a civil partnership. So there may be an attempt in the House of Lords, as there was in the House of Commons, to legalise opposite-sex civil partnerships through an amendment. I suspect probably not, because, you know, in the Commons, when this issue came up, the government and Labour agreed a compromise where that they would undertake a consultation and a review on the issue of heterosexual civil partnerships, which really is somewhat beggars belief, because they have already done the consultation. It was part of the consultation on same-sex marriage, and as I said, the vast majority of people, 61%, said they supported the right of heterosexual couples to have a civil partnership. So it's a bit of a nonsense that they're going to have another consultation and another review. In terms of the legislation before us, the bill before Parliament is not actually true equality. It is mostly equality, and it certainly advances the situation. But the only true equality would be to simply open up the 1949 Marriage Act to same-sex couples by repealing the 1973 Matrimonial Causes Act. That would be the way to establish true equality. But what the government has done is introduce a whole new separate bill, which has a number of anomalies, a number of differences between the 1949 Marriage Act and this new marriage same-sex couples bill. And briefly, there are four main ones I'd draw your attention to. First of all, under the Marriage Act of 1949, non-consummation is a grounds for annulment, and adultery is a grounds for divorce. Those grounds are not included in the current same-sex marriage bill. So non-consummation will not be a grounds for annulling a same-sex marriage, and nor will adultery be a grounds for annulling a same-sex marriage. The other discrimination is in pension inheritance and entitlement. As you know, under the Civil Partnership Act, civil partners do not have the same pension inheritance rights as married heterosexual couples. Under this new bill, those discriminations are reiterated. So under the same-sex marriage bill, if one partner of a same-sex marriage dies, the surviving partner will only be able to inherit the pension from the date of contributions being paid in 2005. So the accrual point will be from 2005 onwards, even if the person has been paying into their pension since 1970. So they will lose two or more decades of pension entitlement. And that seems to be very, very unfair. A married heterosexual couple, if one partner dies, the surviving spouse will be able to claim and inherit their pension contributions from the very year they first began paying in, which could be, as I said, 1970 or even earlier. But in the case of a same-sex couple, the pension entitlements will only be accrued from 2005. So for some people, that will be a huge financial loss. The other area of discrimination is in terms of religious same-sex marriages. Although the government has agreed to allow religious organisations to opt in and conduct same-sex marriages if they wish to do so, it's a purely voluntary system, as with the civil partnership legislation, that right has hedged with lots of different restrictions. So the restrictions around conducting same-sex religious marriages are much more onerous than the restrictions for conducting religious heterosexual marriages. Just to give you one example, many of the faith organisations, the smaller faith organisations that want to conduct religious same-sex marriages, they're small, they don't have their own churches. They tend to share churches or buildings with other faith organisations. And under the current bill, if a faith organisation wants to conduct a same-sex religious marriage, and if it shares its premises with other faith organisations, then it will have to get the permission of all those other faith organisations before it will be allowed to do so. So in other words, if for example, the Metropolitan Community Church, which is pro-same-sex marriage and wants to conduct same-sex religious marriages, most of those churches share buildings with other black churches, with various evangelical churches, nearly all of which oppose same-sex marriage. So they would use their veto, which would in effect mean that the Metropolitan Community Church will not be able to conduct religious marriages. There are also issues about the licence, which has to be renewed every 3 years, and the cost. Some councils are talking about a fee of up to £3,000, renewable every year. And for a small faith organisation, whatever the faith may be, that's quite an onerous burden financially. So those are some areas of inequality in the so-called Equal Marriage Bill. But nevertheless, the bulk of the bill is right. The bulk of the bill will redress the exclusion of same-sex couples from civil marriage. I'd like to just briefly reflect now on the wider issues, because of course we have made in this country huge, phenomenal, extraordinary changes for LGBT rights in a very short space of time. In 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of homophobic laws of any country on earth. People think that male homosexuality was decriminalised, or legalised even, in 1967. It wasn't. There was a very partial, limited decriminalisation, not a legalisation, but most aspects of gay life remained criminalised. We have only had a penal code that does not discriminate on the basis of sexuality since 2003 with the Sexual Offences Act. So, for example, you're all familiar with the case of Oscar Wilde, who was jailed in 1895 under the so-called gross indecency law. That law remained on the statute books until 2003. The law against so-called buggery, anal sex, which was legislated in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII, was only repealed in 2003. So the criminalisation of homosexuality in this country has only ended 10 years ago. But nevertheless, that has been one of many, many changes. The equalisation of the age of consent, the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children, laws protecting LGBT people against discrimination in the workplace and the provision of goods and services, all these different changes. It's been a phenomenal pace of change. Within about a decade or so, we've gone from being the country with the largest number of homophobic laws to being a country in the world which has some of the best laws on LGBT rights. And that's a huge tribute to all of you and all our straight friends and allies and LGBT people across the country who have lobbied and campaigned over the last, not 10 years, 20 years, but 30 and 40 years. It's the culmination of those efforts. And I can't think of any social law reform campaign in British history which has achieved so many changes so quickly. So it really is an extraordinary contribution and that people have made to bring these changes about. And I want to thank everyone who's been involved in that process of supporting those changes. Of course, we've made great progress here in Britain, but around the world, the picture is very, very different. There are still nearly 80 countries that criminalise homosexuality in all circumstances, with penalties ranging from just a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment, and in a handful of countries, about 7 or 8, there is still the death penalty for same-sex relations. When we look at those 80 countries, we find that more than half of them are members of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, which is supposed to be committed to democracy, human rights, equality, and personal freedom, the Commonwealth is the repository of some of the worst homophobic laws in the world. 80% of Commonwealth countries still criminalise same-sex relations. And as I said, they account for more than half of the global countries that do so. And until very recently, in fact until 2011, the Commonwealth was doing nothing to challenge that. In 2011, on the International Day Against Homophobia, I wrote an article in The Guardian exposing the failure of the Commonwealth to speak out and act against homophobic persecution. And that prompted the General Secretary to write an article in response, which for the first time said explicitly that the Commonwealth was opposed to homophobia, that homophobic discrimination was not compatible with Commonwealth values. That was in 2011. All the lobbying in the decades previously had got nowhere. No Commonwealth Secretary-General was willing to address the issue. And to his credit, the Secretary-General, Kamala Sharma, has on several occasions since reiterated that commitment, that the Commonwealth is opposed to homophobic and transphobic discrimination, that the Commonwealth wants to see equality and human rights for LGBT people. Indeed, he said this in February this year at a meeting of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. So we have, at last, a commitment from the Commonwealth to change things. Getting that change is another question altogether. So many of the Commonwealth countries are adamantly against LGBT rights. And witch hunts going on right now in Cameroon, Nigeria, Uganda, the Gambia, and several other countries. You probably just heard that in the last week, Nigeria has passed one of the most draconian anti-gay laws anywhere in the world. It's officially called a bill against same-sex marriage, which criminalises both participation in a same-sex marriage and witnessing a same-sex marriage. To do either of those things, to participate or witness a same-sex marriage, can get you now, once this bill is signed into law by the President, it will get you upwards of 10 years jail. But what is even more scary is that under the subsidiary provisions of the bill, advocacy of LGBT rights is to be criminalised. The forming of LGBT organisations or membership of LGBT organisations is to be criminalised. Any supportive work towards LGBT communities, such as HIV and AIDS prevention, is to be criminalised. So this is an extremely severe law, and it passed overwhelmingly in both the Senate and the House of Representatives in Nigeria. So it's indicative of the fact that although we have made great progress in Britain, the global picture is far different. Indeed, in some countries, it's getting worse. And I think not just Nigeria, but Uganda, Iraq, Cameroon, the Gambia, Zambia now, the homophobic witch hunts are intensifying. And that is sad and tragic, but I'd say that, unfortunately, this is a process we have to go through. It's not that we want to go through it, but as we know from the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States, as they fought to end the restrictions on black voting rights and to end segregation, the number of racial attacks actually increased, and the victimization of black African-American people got worse. The civil rights activists didn't want that, but that was the price they had to pay to ultimately overcome. And I think this is the experience worldwide, that LGBT people know the risks in these dangerous countries, but feel they have to challenge, because if they don't, they will forever remain second-class and persecuted. So I pay huge tribute to LGBT activists around the world who, in very, very dangerous circumstances, are risking not only their freedom, but in some cases their lives, to secure LGBT equality and freedom. I'm sure you all know the case of David Kato in Uganda, who was brutally murdered a couple of years ago, in one of the country's most prominent LGBT campaigners, beaten, hacked to death. Really, really, grotesque violence. But David knew the risks, and it's a great tribute to his courage and integrity that, despite knowing the risks, he continued that important work. He is a real hero, a real icon of the global movement for LGBT equality. Just perhaps finally, to bring it back to Britain again, once we get the same-sex marriage bill through Parliament, and hopefully it will become law by the end of the summer, and we'll see the first same-sex marriages soon afterwards, what else is there to do? Well, that is the last major legal discrimination. The last major legal discrimination. But there are some smaller, minor ones. Well, depends on your perspective. Some people say they're major ones. If you're a person of faith, they're major ones. All the different equality laws, including the protections against discrimination in the workplace and the protection against the discrimination in the provision of goods and services, all these laws have limited qualified exemptions for faith organisations. So under these exemptions, faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, hospices are all allowed to discriminate against LGBT people if it is done to, quote, conform to their religious ethos. So that's an area where ongoing discrimination is actually legalised in law. Another issue is, of course, the way in which LGBT asylum seekers are treated. All asylum seekers get a very hard, rough deal, but LGBT asylum seekers fleeing persecution in violently homophobic countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, they have to jump through so many more hurdles. They're subject to so much more disbelief. The failure rate of their applications is much, much higher than average. And that is because there is a homophobic mindset in many Home Office barristers and adjudicators who sit in judgment. I've often heard it said that, you know, a petite, pretty, feminine woman will have her lesbianism challenged and questioned because, quote, you don't look like a lesbian. You know, I've heard, you know, other occasions, Home Office adjudicators say that, well, you know, you could go back to your home country, you could change your name, you could move to a part of the country where no one knows you, you could give up having same-sex relationships. Then no one will know you're a lesbian, and you won't be persecuted. Now, thankfully, that was ruled illegal by the High Court, I think in 2010. But that's what used to happen very often. There's also, of course, an issue, particularly, again, of lesbians. Many of them, because of family pressure, religious pressure, community pressure, will reluctantly marry and have children. And the fact that they are or have been married and have children will be counted against them by the asylum system. That will be adduced as evidence that you're not really a lesbian. You know, not understanding the cultural pressures and factors that force many lesbian women into getting married in some countries. So there is, as you probably know, the work that my own foundation does, plus the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group. Together we work to try and help and support those LGBT asylum seekers, many of who have had just tell terrible, heartbreaking stories of attempts to kill them, in some cases their partners having been killed. You know, they come here absolutely traumatized and they have to go through this system which constantly challenges and questions them. You know, it's right that every asylum seeker should be questioned about the authenticity of their case, but the humiliations. I mean, nowadays we have many adjudicators saying to LGBT refugees, well, I've read your statement, I've read your witness statements, I've read the testimony from your partner, I still don't believe you're gay. And so the question is, how do they prove that they're gay? So what increasingly LGBT refugees are having to do is to photograph or even video themselves having sex and produce that in court. I mean, this is shocking humiliation. Shocking. And these people often come from cultures where, you know, sexuality is a very private matter and where it's a great humiliation to have to publicly expose themselves having sex. But they're finding that this is the only evidence that will actually get them asylum. And I've just been fantastic news of a Malawian asylum seeker just won asylum last week. But he said what clinched it was the video I had to produce. Up until that point, there was doubt. But he felt really humiliated and really, embarrassed and ashamed that he had to do this. But he had to do it because otherwise he may not have got his asylum, even though he's absolutely perfectly legitimate grounds for seeking refugee status. The final thing I'll just raise is the ongoing issue of homophobic bullying and transphobic bullying in our schools. Still, more than half of young people say that they have personally experienced or witnessed homophobic and transphobic bullying in schools. Schools are supposed to be places of safety and security, yet so many of young people have experienced threats, teasing, and sometimes actual physical violence. We know that still today, only about half of all schools have anti-bullying programs that explicitly address the issue of homophobic and transphobic bullying. And that in faith schools, there's anecdotal evidence which suggests that bullying is worst there, and also that the faith schools, do the least to challenge it. So there's a big, big issue. And I would like to see classes in equality and diversity from the first year of primary school, so that young kids are helped to be educated, to reject all forms of prejudice, whether it be on the grounds of race, gender, disability, faith, sexuality, or gender identity. We know that young kids are not born bigoted, they become bigoted. And we know from the best practice in some cities and countries where they have education against prejudice in schools, those young people tend to be more tolerant, more understanding, more accepting of those who are different. I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be part of our curriculum, because if we want to live in a humane, compassionate, caring society where everyone feels included and valued, then we do need to challenge prejudice. Not just prejudice against LGBT people, but prejudice against anyone and everyone. So a bit more work to do, but we are on the way, and again, huge thanks to all of you who've been part of this process of helping overturn homophobia. Thank you.